The cul-de-sac of Willow Lane was as pristine as it was quiet, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges, freshly painted fences, and perfectly aligned mailboxes. It was the kind of place where the neighbors knew each other by name, or at least thought they did. On this particular morning, 28-year-old Derek Harris was finishing his delivery route. As a driver for a popular package delivery service, Derek took pride in his work. He enjoyed meeting new people, and the satisfaction of ensuring packages made it to their destinations on time. Today, however, was special. Derek wasn't just delivering packages, he was dropping off a long-awaited delivery to his own home. After months of renovations, his new smart entertainment system had finally arrived. He had chosen to personally handle the delivery as a way of savoring the moment. Dressed in his work uniform, Derek pulled his delivery van into Willow Lane, smiling as he spotted his house at the end of the street. The crisp white shutters and blooming flower beds were a source of pride. He and his wife, Camille, had worked hard to create their dream home. But as Derek parked the van and hopped out, a voice cut through the tranquil morning air. "Hey, what do you think you're doing here?" Derek turned to see a middle-aged woman marching toward him from across the street. Her expression was a mixture of suspicion and disdain. She wore a tracksuit, her arms crossed tightly as she glared at him. "Good morning," Derek said politely, holding up the package. "Just making a delivery." The woman scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "I don't think so. You don't belong here." Derek frowned, surprised by her hostility. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. I have a delivery for this address." She took a step closer, her voice rising. "I don't care where you say you're delivering. This is a private neighborhood and we don't need people like you snooping around." Derek's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Ma'am, I'm not snooping. I live here." The woman's laugh was sharp and mocking. "You live here? That's rich. I've never seen you before and I know everyone in this neighborhood." "Well," Derek said evenly, "maybe you don't know everyone as well as you think." The woman's face turned red with anger. "You need to leave. Now. Or I'll call the police." Derek looked at her for a long moment, then simply said, "You can do whatever you think is necessary." He turned away, the package in his hands, and began walking up the driveway to his house. The woman stood frozen, confusion flickering across her face as she watched him unlock the front door and step inside. The woman, whose name was Karen, stood frozen on the sidewalk, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. She watched as Derek stepped into the house, the package still in his hands, and closed the door behind him. For a moment, her mind struggled to process what she had just witnessed. "That can't be right," she muttered under her breath. "There's no way he lives there." Karen glanced nervously around the cul-de-sac, hoping someone else had seen what had just happened. But the street remained quiet, with no one around to back up her assumptions. Feeling both embarrassed and indignant, she crossed the street and marched up to Derek's front door. Meanwhile, inside the house, Derek set the package down on the kitchen counter, shaking his head in frustration. He pulled out his phone to text his wife, Camille, about the incident. Before he could type a word, the doorbell rang. Derek frowned, already guessing who it might be. Taking a deep breath, he walked to the door and opened it. Sure enough, Karen stood there, her arms crossed and her expression accusatory. "I need to speak with you," she demanded. Derek leaned against the doorframe, his calm demeanor masking his irritation. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" Karen hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the van parked in his driveway. "I want to know what you're really doing here. You can't possibly own this house." Derek raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" Karen stammered, caught off guard by the directness of his question. "Well, I mean, people like you don't usually, live in a neighborhood like this?" Derek finished for her, his tone sharp. Karen's cheeks flushed. "That's not what I meant." "Sure sounded like it," Derek replied, his voice calm but firm. "Look, ma'am, I don't know what kind of person you think I am, but I live here. My wife and I bought this house last year. We've been renovating it for months." Karen blinked, her indignation faltering. You're serious? Derek folded his arms, meeting her gaze. Very. For a moment, Karen said nothing. Then, as if realizing the depth of her mistake, she muttered, I didn't mean to offend you. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Derek's expression didn't soften. If that's true, then maybe next time, you should ask questions before making assumptions. Karen nodded stiffly, her face red with embarrassment. I'll keep that in mind. Without waiting for a response, Derek closed the door. He stood there for a moment, shaking his head, before heading back to the kitchen to finish unpacking. Outside, Karen turned and walked away, her steps slower than before. For the first time, she felt the weight of her actions, and a nagging sense of guilt she couldn't ignore. Karen returned to her house across the street, her thoughts swirling with confusion and embarrassment. She replayed the interaction with Derek in her mind, the weight of his words settling heavier with each pass. Sitting at her kitchen table, she stared out the window at Derek's house, the van still parked in the driveway. How could I have been so wrong? She whispered to herself. Her neighbor, Margaret, stopped by for their usual Saturday coffee. Margaret, always curious about neighborhood happenings, noticed Karen's distracted demeanor. Karen, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Karen hesitated but then sighed, recounting the morning's events. As she finished, Margaret gave her a long, disapproving look. Karen, I can't believe you did that, Margaret said, her tone a mix of shock and disappointment. Do you realize how awful that must have been for him? He lives here, for heaven's sake. Karen flushed. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. How was I supposed to know he owned the house? Margaret shook her head. That's the problem, Karen. You assumed. You didn't ask questions. You just jumped to conclusions. Karen looked away, guilt prickling at her. I didn't mean for it to come across like that. But it did, Margaret said firmly. And now you need to fix it. Karen frowned. How am I supposed to do that? Apologize, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. And mean it. Karen's stomach twisted at the thought. She had never been one to admit she was wrong, but deep down, she knew Margaret was right. With a reluctant sigh, she nodded. I'll talk to him. Back at his house, Derek was unpacking the delivery when Camille walked into the room. Hey babe, how'd the delivery go? Derek gave her a wry smile. It was fine, until the neighbor decided I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. Camille raised an eyebrow. What happened? Derek recounted the encounter, and by the time he finished, Camille's hands were on her hips. Unbelievable. Did she even apologize? Nope, Derek said. She just muttered something about protecting the neighborhood and walked off. Camille shook her head. Some people. Do you think she'll come around? Derek shrugged. Maybe. But honestly, I'm not waiting for her to realize how wrong she was. I've got better things to do. Camille smiled and kissed him on the cheek. That's why I love you. You don't let stuff like this get to you. It's not worth the energy, Derek replied. But if she does come back, I hope she's ready to actually listen. Outside, Karen stood on her porch, wringing her hands. She took a deep breath and started walking toward Derek's house, rehearsing the apology she knew she had to give. Karen stood on Derek's porch, her hand hovering over the doorbell. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as a wave of anxiety washed over her. Apologizing was not something she did often, but this situation weighed heavily on her conscience. Taking a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. A moment later, Derek opened the door, his expression neutral but curious. Ma'am, he said evenly, can I help you? Karen fidgeted with the strap of her handbag, avoiding eye contact for a moment before finally looking up at him. I just wanted to apologize, she began, her voice shaky, for how I acted earlier. Derek leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. Go on. Karen swallowed hard. I was wrong to make assumptions about you. I shouldn't have judged you without knowing anything about you or why you were here. It was unfair, and I'm sorry. Derek studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You're right. It was unfair and hurtful. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to deal with this kind of thing over and over again? Karen's shoulders slumped. I can't imagine, and that's part of the problem. I've lived in this neighborhood for years, and I thought I knew everyone. But that doesn't excuse how I treated you. Derek nodded slightly, his posture relaxing just a bit. It doesn't excuse it, but acknowledging it is a step in the right direction. Karen hesitated, then added, I've been thinking a lot about what you said earlier, about asking questions instead of jumping to conclusions. You're right. I need to do better, and I will. Derek gave a small nod. Good. Because this neighborhood isn't just yours, it's mine too. My wife and I worked hard for this house, just like everyone else here. We're not going anywhere. Karen managed a small smile, though it was tinged with guilt. I hope we can start fresh. I'd like to get to know you and your family. Derek considered her words for a moment before stepping aside. Would you like to come in for a minute? My wife's here, and I think she'd appreciate hearing what you just said. Karen blinked, surprised by the offer. Are you sure? Yeah, Derek said with a faint smile. If we're going to start fresh, we might as well do it right. Karen nodded, stepping inside. It was the beginning of a conversation she knew she needed to have, a chance to rebuild trust and, hopefully, learn from her mistakes. Karen stepped into Derek's home, taking in the warm, welcoming atmosphere. The living room was tastefully decorated with family photos on the walls, a cozy sofa, and a shelf lined with books and personal mementos. It was a space that reflected love and care, something Karen hadn't expected but now couldn't ignore. Camille entered the room, her expression cautious but curious. Hi, I'm Camille, she said, extending a hand to Karen. You must be one of our neighbors. Karen shook her hand nervously. Yes, I'm Karen. I live across the street. She hesitated before adding, I came to apologize for how I treated Derek earlier. Camille glanced at Derek, who gave her a reassuring nod. I see, Camille said, her voice measured. Well, I appreciate you coming over to say that. Karen fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable but determined to explain herself. I made a terrible mistake, she said. I assumed things about Derek that weren't true, and I acted in a way that was unfair and wrong. I want you both to know that I'm sorry, and I'll do my best to be a better neighbor moving forward. Camille's expression softened slightly. Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Karen nodded. I realize now how harmful assumptions can be. Seeing Derek walk into his own home, it made me stop and think about how I treat people. I shouldn't have to see proof of someone's worth to respect them. Derek, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. We all make mistakes, Karen. What matters is what you do next. If you're serious about being better, we're willing to move forward. Karen's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time that day, she felt a genuine sense of relief. I am serious, she said earnestly, and I appreciate your willingness to give me a second chance. As Karen left their home later that afternoon, she felt a mix of gratitude and determination. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could learn from it. Over the next few weeks, she made an effort to connect with Derek and Camille, greeting them warmly when they crossed paths, and even dropping off a homemade pie as a peace offering. For Derek and Camille, the incident became a reminder of the challenges they still faced, but also of the importance of standing their ground and fostering change where they could. They continued to build their life in the neighborhood, forming new connections and breaking down barriers, one interaction at a time. Months later, the cul-de-sac of Willow Lane had become a more inclusive and welcoming place. Karen, once quick to judge, was now an advocate for building community and treating everyone with respect. And as for Derek, every time he parked his delivery van in his driveway, he did so with pride, knowing he had turned an uncomfortable moment into an opportunity for growth, not just for Karen, but for the entire neighborhood.